What happens when a black woman is handcuffed in public, only for everyone to later realize she was the one who wrote the law they violated? She followed every rule, stood in the right line, held a valid boarding pass, but still, two officers, and one wealthy passenger, saw only her skin. They didn't ask who she was. They assumed. They acted. And they humiliated her in front of a terminal full of strangers. But what they didn't know was that this quiet woman wasn't just another traveler. She was Chief Judge Celeste Morgan, one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. And by the time they found out, it was already too late. This is the story of how one silent arrest unraveled an entire system, and how a single act of quiet resistance reshaped everything. The late afternoon rush at Westbridge International Airport played out like a well-rehearsed overture. Families shuffled through security, business travelers paced near boarding zones, and loudspeakers pulsed overhead in staccato bursts of boarding calls. At Gate C-17, the line for business class priority boarding was already forming. Near the front stood a woman who, even in stillness, radiated composure. Her posture was upright but unhurried. A sleek black blazer paired with tailored gray slacks. No unnecessary accessories, only a silver-banded watch and a leather tote worn with familiarity. Her skin was deep brown, her coiled hair pulled neatly into a low twist at the nape. Her name was Judge Celeste Morgan, 53 years old, and the quiet confidence in her bearing had been earned over decades. She didn't need to announce herself. She rarely did. As a federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals, she had spent years mastering the language of law, of balance, of restraint. Today she was returning home from a legal ethics summit, just one of many such events she attended, often alone and always unguarded. But at this moment, Judge Morgan was not seen as a jurist. She was seen as a black woman standing in a line that some believed she didn't belong in. A few rows behind her, Eleanor Stratton, a wealthy white woman in her 60s dressed head to toe in designer beige, stood fidgeting with her silk scarf. Her wrists glinted with diamonds, her lips pursed in displeasure. She had noticed Celeste almost immediately. Her eyes lingered too long, her brows creased slightly. She whispered something under her breath and gave an audible sigh. Then she approached the young gate agent with an air of exaggerated concern. "Excuse me," she said, her tone smooth but undercut with vinegar. "I don't mean to make a fuss, but that woman—" She tilted her head toward Celeste. "She's been standing there for a while, watching people, watching bags. It's unsettling." The gate agent blinked. She checked in. "She's on the manifest, business class." Stratton's voice dropped but didn't lower. "Well, you can never be too careful nowadays. People have all kinds of tricks. Some just know how to look the part." That last line wasn't vague, it was calculated. A moment later, two officers from airport security arrived. Officer Greg Wilburn, seasoned, slow-moving, and stone-faced, and Officer Dylan Hart, younger, stiffer, already scanning the space for the problem he had been called to confront. Stratton spotted them immediately and switched tones with practiced ease. "Officers, thank goodness, it's her," she said, pointing directly at Celeste. "She's been eyeing my luggage and acting very strangely. I don't feel safe." Wilburn's gaze locked onto Celeste. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at her boarding pass. He saw a black woman in business class, and that, to him, was enough to warrant suspicion. Hart followed his lead. They walked toward Celeste with heavy steps, as though the conclusion had already been written. Celeste looked up from her tablet, and in the space of a heartbeat, she understood exactly what was about to happen. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because in America, even a black woman in a blazer, silent, credentialed, and standing in the right line, can still be seen as a threat. The atmosphere at Gate C-17 shifted the moment officers Greg Wilburn and Dylan Hart stepped in front of Celeste Morgan. What had been ordinary airport noise now felt tense. Conversations hushed. The gate agent looked on helplessly. The other passengers pretended to scroll through their phones, though several couldn't help but watch. Wilburn's tone was clipped. "Ma'am, step out of the line. We need a word." Celeste blinked once, then calmly closed her tablet. "I'm happy to cooperate," she said, her voice composed. "But may I ask why I'm being singled out?" "No need to make this difficult," Officer Hart cut in, already annoyed by her poise. "We received a concern. We're doing our job." Celeste glanced briefly at Eleanor Stratton, who now stood off to the side with arms crossed and a smug gleam in her eyes. "I see," Celeste murmured, more to herself than to them. She stepped aside. Wilburn extended a hand. "Your ID and boarding pass, please." Without hesitation, Celeste reached into her bag and retrieved both. She handed them over with a steady grip. Wilburn looked at the documents, frowned slightly, and looked back at her. "Business class, huh?" he muttered, as if the words tasted strange in his mouth. "Renee, Celeste Morgan." "Judge Celeste Morgan," she corrected evenly. "And yes, business class, paid in full by the Federal Judicial Conference." Hart scoffed. "You're a judge?" "I am." Wilburn narrowed his eyes. "What kind of judge travels alone without security?" "The kind who doesn't expect to be harassed at an airport," she replied. Hart's lips curled. "A little defensive, aren't we?" Celeste's jaw tightened, but her tone remained neutral. "I'm answering your questions. Now, unless you have reason to suspect a crime, I would like my documents returned." Wilburn didn't move. Instead, he looked her up and down. His gaze lingered on her watch, her shoes, her bag. "Where'd you get all this? Looks a little high-end for someone in public service." "That's not a question you're authorized to ask," Celeste said, calm but firm. "I have shown you valid ID and a legitimate boarding pass. If there's anything else you require, say so clearly. If not, I'd like your names and badge numbers, please." There was no anger in her voice, only precision. That's what got under their skin. Not resistance, not even defiance, but dignity. The kind they didn't know how to control. Hart stepped in, inches from her now. "You think we're here to play nice? You're the one acting suspicious, asking all these questions, demanding things." Celeste held her ground. "I am asking for what the law entitles me to. You approached me without probable cause. You made insinuations about my profession and character in public. You've refused to explain your reasoning, and now you're escalating because I refuse to be passive." Wilburn's face reddened. "You people always twist everything into some civil rights stunt." That did it. Celeste exhaled slowly and looked him dead in the eye. "This isn't a stunt. This is reality, and you're proving exactly why people like me are tired of staying quiet." A murmur stirred behind them. Someone shifting, someone filming. But the officers weren't watching the crowd anymore. Their attention was fixed on the woman in front of them who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved an inch out of line, and yet somehow made them feel completely exposed. Officer Greg Wilburn took a step back, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near his belt. Across from him, Judge Celeste Morgan stood motionless, her arms relaxed at her sides, her spine impossibly straight, her chin unshaken. And yet somehow, it was she who made him feel small. Dignity, when unbent, can be mistaken for defiance, and to men like Wilburn and Hart, that was unacceptable. "I've had enough of this," Hart snapped. "She's refusing to comply. She's escalating." "I've complied with everything," Celeste replied, her tone as even as ever. "You have no legal grounds to detain me, no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, and certainly no right to lay hands on me." Wilburn didn't answer. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "Disrupting public order, interfering with airport security." Then louder, loud enough to echo, "You're under arrest!" A collective gasp rippled through the line. Passengers froze mid-step. A mother covered her child's eyes. A businessman lowered his phone, recording now without shame. Celeste didn't move. "Don't do this," she said quietly. "You'll regret it." But regret had no room in men blinded by ego. Hart lunged first. His hand clamped around her wrist. Tight, too tight. Wilburn followed, grabbing the other. Together they twisted her arms behind her back with more force than needed. Celeste winced, but didn't cry out. She stood her ground until the cold snap of metal closed around both wrists. Handcuffed. Publicly. A federal judge, paraded like a suspect. From behind the crowd, Eleanor Stratton smiled, arms folded, chin tilted, pleased. This was what she came for. Not safety, not accountability. Control. One of the officers barked, "Make way!" The crowd parted in stunned silence as the two officers led Celeste away from gate C-17. Her suitcase remained behind. Her boarding pass crumpled on the floor. Her bag hung off her shoulder by a single strap. And still, she walked, head high, posture intact. People stared, some with horror, some with confusion, some with silent complicity. But no one stopped them. A few took videos. One woman whispered to her partner, "She didn't do anything. She was just standing there." Celeste heard it. She heard all of it. But she didn't break. Because she knew this moment would not end here. Not with handcuffs, nor humiliation. The damage was real, yes, but it was not final. As they marched her down the terminal, her wrists throbbed, but her eyes remained forward. She was not just walking in shame, she was walking into history. The holding room was small and sterile, tucked behind frosted glass near the far end of Terminal C. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A metal bench hugged the wall. One security monitor blinked silently in the corner. On the other side of the desk, a duty officer lazily clicked through intake forms, unaware of the storm gathering outside these beige walls. Judge Celeste Morgan sat handcuffed on the bench, her hands marked red from the too-tight grip of steel. Her blazer was slightly wrinkled from the struggle, but her presence remained untouched. Dignity, after all, was not something fabric could hold or break. Officer Dylan Hart paced the floor, still fuming. "You know," he muttered, "if you'd just shut your mouth, this could have gone a whole lot smoother." Wilburn leaned on the counter, smirking. Some people think a sharp tongue makes them innocent. Celeste didn't look at either of them. She focused instead on the hum of the AC unit and the clatter of keys on the duty officer's keyboard. Then the intake began. The officer cleared his throat. "Name?" "Celeste Morgan," she answered. He typed. "Date of birth?" She answered again. Then came the pause, the question they asked every detainee but rarely listened to with interest. "Occupation?" Hart chuckled in the background. "Yeah, tell us what kind of work you do when you're not arguing with cops in terminals." Celeste raised her eyes, slow and deliberate. Her voice was clear, controlled, devastatingly calm. "I am Chief Judge Celeste Morgan of the United States Court of Appeals." The keyboard stopped. So did the air. The duty officer looked up, mouth slightly open. Wilburn blinked, then laughed, just once. "Nice try." Celeste reached into her inner blazer pocket with the same grace she would have used on the bench. From it, she retrieved a leather badge wallet, folded, official, and embossed with the seal of the United States Judiciary. The silence now was not awkward. It was surgical. Hart's jaw slackened. His hand hovered awkwardly near his radio like he wasn't sure if he should call for backup or a lawyer. Wilburn stepped back, bumping into the desk behind him. Judge Morgan," the duty officer repeated, slowly realizing the hierarchy he had just stumbled into. Celeste nodded once. "Yes. And you've just violated federal protocol, subjected a sitting appellate judge to unlawful detainment, and humiliated me in full public view, without cause, without process, and without a trace of professionalism." Hart suddenly looked younger, smaller, sweat pooled above his collar. Wilburn's voice broke. "We didn't know. You weren't identified. We were just responding to a complaint." Celeste's stare didn't blink. "You didn't ask. You assumed. And you acted." The room no longer felt neutral. It felt like a courtroom. And for once, they were the ones on trial. The silence in the holding room deepened. Not out of confusion, but out of clarity. For the first time since stepping off that business class line, Celeste Morgan was no longer seen as a passenger. She was no longer a suspicious woman in line. She was now, unmistakably, the law. She turned to the duty officer, her voice cool but charged with institutional weight. "Remove these handcuffs." The officer hesitated, glancing nervously at Wilburn and Hart, men who had, moments earlier, wielded full control. "I said remove them. That's an order," Celeste repeated, not louder, but sharper. The officer reached for his keys with a hand that trembled slightly. The first cuff clicked open, then the second. Celeste pulled her wrists free, rubbing the raw skin without a word of complaint. Then she stepped forward. Every movement was deliberate. Not performative, not angry, measured. The same way a judge would step down from the bench after issuing a ruling that left no room for appeal. She turned back to the duty officer. "You will contact the following individuals immediately," she said, her tone that of someone used to giving orders that were followed. 1. The airport police chief. 2. The regional office of the U.S. Marshal Service. 3. The office of the Chief Justice of the United States Court of Appeals. The officer stared, blinking. "Yes, Your Honor. Tell them I'm here. Tell them what's happened. And tell them I expect a full federal response within the hour." Wilburn looked as if he might speak, but Celeste's gaze silenced him. Hart had already taken a step toward the wall, as though hoping to disappear into it. "You two," Celeste said, her voice cutting clean through the room, "will remain here. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not touch a single piece of paper or keyboard. Every second from this moment forward is being watched." The duty officer nodded rapidly and picked up the phone. Outside the door, the sounds of the airport continued, muffled boarding announcements, rolling luggage, intercom feedback. But inside this fluorescent-lit room, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Where moments ago there had been smugness, now there was stillness. Where there had been casual arrogance, now awaiting dread. Because once a judge speaks under authority, especially a federal judge, those words become orders, not opinions. Celeste stepped back, standing in the middle of the room now, not a detainee, but a figure of command. Her voice had never risen. Her hands had never clenched. And yet she had done what few people ever could. She turned a holding room into a courtroom, and the arresting officers into defendants still wearing their uniforms. 28 minutes after the calls were placed, the air around the airport holding room grew dense with authority. It began with the unmistakable rhythm of polished shoes against tile. Then came the low murmur of radios, the flash of official credentials, the clipped voices of federal agents identifying themselves. The first to arrive was Airport Police Chief Donald Reyes, a veteran in his late 50s with graying temples and eyes that had seen both order and scandal. But when he stepped into that small fluorescent room and saw Judge Celeste Morgan seated, uncuffed but unmistakably dignified, his composure faltered. "Your Honor," he said, removing his cap with quiet urgency, "I've just been briefed. Please accept my deepest apologies for this egregious error." Celeste didn't stand. She simply looked at him. "This wasn't a mistake," she replied. "It was a pattern, finally interrupted." Chief Reyes swallowed hard. Behind him, agents from the U.S. Marshal's service entered the room. 2 deputies in dark suits, followed closely by Deputy Marshal Linda Reyes, no relation to the chief but clearly the one in command. Her nod to Celeste was sharp, respectful. "We're here to escort you and begin documentation," the deputy marshal said quietly. "The circuit's chief of staff is en route. A federal response team is already reviewing surveillance footage." Next came Mr. Ethan Gold, chief administrator of the U.S. Court of Appeals Regional Office, who had flown in from a nearby district chamber as soon as the news broke. He carried a leather folder thick with forms and legal briefs, but when he saw Celeste, he paused with genuine concern. "You shouldn't have had to make this call," he said. "No," Celeste said evenly, "but I did, and now we do it by the book." She gave a detailed statement, clear, chronological, without embellishment. From Stratton's initial false complaint to the verbal harassment, the public arrest, and the discovery of her identity, she recounted each moment with the same composure she used to deliver rulings from the bench. The room listened in silence. No one interrupted. Chief Reyes stood frozen, his face growing more ashen with every sentence. When she finished, she handed over the nameplate from her court ID and looked directly at him. "I expect 2 things, Chief," she said. "An immediate and transparent suspension of both officers involved, and a joint investigation with federal civil rights oversight. Anything less would be a failure of your office and of your badge." Chief Reyes nodded, almost numbly. "Understood, Your Honor. Officers Wilburn and Hart are hereby suspended effective immediately, pending internal review. Their weapons, badges, and access credentials will be revoked within the hour." The 2 officers, now relegated to the edge of the room, stood motionless, stripped of the control they had wielded so recklessly just hours earlier. Wilburn looked away. Hart stared blankly at the floor. The balance of power had shifted, not through a press conference or a viral video, but through due process, invoked with precision and enforced by those who actually understood its weight. And though the airport resumed its ordinary rhythm beyond those doors, what had just occurred inside this quiet office would leave an echo. One loud enough to reach courtrooms, policy rooms, and press rooms far beyond Westbridge International. By Monday morning, the walls of Westbridge International Airport no longer held the story inside. The investigation had moved quickly, too quickly for anyone to bury it quietly. Within 48 hours, joint task forces from the airport's Internal Affairs Division, the U.S., Marshal's Service, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice had compiled a full digital footprint of the incident. And the truth was irrefutable. From the moment Eleanor Stratton had approached the gate agent with her theatrical claims, every camera had been rolling. High-resolution security feeds, body camera footage from officers Wilburn and Hart, even cell phone recordings from passengers who had instinctively started filming the moment things felt off. Together they painted a damning mosaic. In the footage, Judge Celeste Morgan could be seen standing calmly in line, hands resting lightly on the handle of her suitcase. No raised voice, no suspicious behavior, just patience, posture, and presence. Stratton, on the other hand, was seen gesturing, whispering, pressing the agent, then smirking the moment officers were summoned. Her words, though low, were caught clearly on security mics. "She's been staring at people's bags. I don't feel safe flying with people like that." There it was. Not suspicion. Bias, weaponized. Body cam audio captured every subsequent exchange. The sharp demands, the dismissive tone, the mocking disbelief when Celeste identified herself as a judge. Even Hart's angry outburst, recorded word for word. "You people always twist everything into some civil rights stunt." That line played on every news segment that week. It was not just a slip of the tongue, it was a philosophy laid bare. Testimonies followed. Airport staff, bystanders, even the young gate agent who admitted in a written statement that Stratton had pressured him with coded language, and that he felt uncomfortable but unsure how to push back. The media seized the story, but it wasn't sensationalism. It was accountability. Headlines hit national wires. Federal judge wrongfully detained after false complaint by wealthy passenger. Airport officers suspended after judge's identity revealed. Body cam footage confirms racial profiling at Westbridge. By Tuesday, civil rights attorneys were already calling for broader reviews of airport policing policies. On Wednesday, editorial boards weighed in, calling it a cautionary tale of how bias still travels freely, even when people of color follow every rule. As for Eleanor Stratton, her life of curated privilege began to unravel. She was summoned for questioning and informed that she may face federal charges under 18 U.S. Code 1001 for providing false statements to law enforcement, as well as civil penalties for discriminatory incitement. Her attorneys issued a statement citing misunderstanding and emotional distress, but no one was buying it, not after the footage. Not after the world had seen what racial profiling looks like when caught in HD, narrated by silence, and ended by a title no one expected, Chief Judge. But Celeste never sought revenge. She didn't need to. The facts were enough. And now, those facts were doing what her dignity alone had once tried to manage in silence. They were speaking for her, and far beyond her. The internal investigation concluded faster than expected. The evidence was too overwhelming, too meticulously documented to leave room for ambiguity. Within 10 days of the incident at Gate C-17, officers Greg Wilburn and Dylan Hart were officially terminated from the Westbridge Airport Police Department. There were no farewells, no final salutes, only silence. Their dismissals were not quietly filed away in personnel records. They were made public, with full statements from the Airport Authority, the Department of Justice, and federal judicial oversight committees. Each document echoed the same conclusion: gross misconduct, racial bias, abuse of power, and unlawful detention of a sitting federal judge. But administrative removal was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia filed formal federal indictments against both men. The charges included violation of civil rights under color of law, 18 U.S. Code 242, unlawful detention without probable cause, conspiracy to deprive a citizen of protected rights. Public interest surged again as the case moved to federal court. Inside the courtroom, the roles were reversed. Wilburn and Hart now sat where they had once placed others, at the defense table, no longer shielded by uniforms or the authority they once misused. The prosecution presented a methodical case. Body cam footage, eyewitness testimony, gate surveillance, audio recordings, the sworn statement of Chief Judge Celeste Morgan. It was not emotion that swayed the jury. It was detail, the language, the assumptions, the visible disdain on their faces when confronted with a black woman they could not control. In closing arguments, the prosecutor's voice echoed in the courtroom, "This is not a case about mistaken identity. This is not a lapse in judgment. This is what happens when power is wielded without conscience, and when racial bias is allowed to operate behind a badge." After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty on all counts. The courtroom remained still as the judge, one of Celeste Morgan's colleagues on the federal bench, prepared to deliver sentencing. Her voice was measured, but each word struck with clarity. You did not simply violate policy. You violated the constitutional rights of a citizen. And you did so with arrogance, with contempt, and with full awareness of your authority. That the citizen happened to be a federal judge only magnifies the gravity of what you did. This was not policing, this was persecution. Both men were sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, the maximum allowable under the plea negotiated structure. No possibility of early release, no deferred service. As officers escorted them out of the courtroom, they passed beneath the seal of the federal court, a symbol they had once served, and now stood convicted for betraying. Outside, reporters crowded the steps. But Celeste Morgan was not there. She had returned to the bench 2 days prior, quietly, with no press release, no interview. Her work, she had said, would always speak louder than her outrage. And now, the law had spoken back. While the trial of Officers Wilburn and Hart had concluded with a clear and firm message, the justice system wasn't finished. There was still one voice, low and insidious, that had set the entire incident in motion. Eleanor Stratton. Her words had not been shouted. They had not come with badges or handcuffs. But they had triggered both. And now, they were returning to her. Following the federal investigation, Stratton was formally charged under 18 U.S. Code 4-1001 for knowingly making a false statement to federal officers, a felony. In addition, she faced a separate count for inciting discriminatory enforcement in a public security setting, a rarely invoked but serious civil rights violation. For someone long accustomed to curated charity galas, discreet donations, and appearances in luxury lifestyle columns, the glare of legal accountability came as a shock. Her attorneys moved quickly. They negotiated a plea deal, hoping to avoid the public spectacle of a criminal trial. Under the agreement, Stratton pled guilty to the lesser offense of obstruction and malicious false reporting. But the consequences, though quieter than a prison sentence, struck just as deeply. She was ordered to pay a $475,000 civil penalty, a sum intended not just as punishment, but as precedent. It was the kind of judgment that followed a person through boardrooms, fundraisers, and family estates. And it did. Her name was removed from the foundation board of 3 major arts institutions. Her legacy fund at a private college was dissolved by student vote. Major brands she had once partnered with issued press statements distancing themselves from her conduct. But perhaps the most lasting consequence didn't come from the court or the media. It came from the classroom. At 3 law schools and 2 federal training centers, Stratton's actions were converted into official case study material used in modules on implicit bias, false reporting, and the social consequences of racial profiling. In one seminar, her name was presented not with rage, but with analysis. Her photo, elegant, expressionless. The caption, "One call, one assumption, one life disrupted. This is how prejudice hides in public civility." Stratton tried for a time to recover, to issue carefully worded statements of remorse, to paint herself as misinformed, afraid, concerned. But the video footage, and the national conversation it sparked, left no room for soft rewrites. She had not been confused. She had been deliberate. And while she never wore a badge, she had handed power to those who did, with bias as the weapon. The court's decision to forego prison time in favor of public consequence was not mercy, it was strategy. Because for a woman who once believed image was everything, the irreparable damage to reputation became its own kind of sentence. Celeste Morgan never uttered Stratton's name again. She didn't need to. The country already had. The marble hall outside courtroom 7C looked no different than it had before. Same heavy doors, same polished floors, same coat of arms mounted high above the bench. But when Judge Celeste Morgan stepped back into chambers, flanked by 2 law clerks and a case file in hand, something invisible had shifted. She had returned. Not quietly, not triumphantly, but with the steadiness of someone who knew the weight of public betrayal and chose, still, to uphold the law with clarity. In the weeks following the incident at Westbridge International, her story had been told across newsrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms nationwide. Commentators used words like landmark, catalyst, and symbol. But for Celeste, the word that remained with her was simpler: witness. Because more than a federal judge, more than a headline, more than a victim, she had stood as witness to something too many still denied. That even in suits, even with status, Black women are not exempt from suspicion. That dignity doesn't always protect. And that silence, especially in public spaces, can still echo with deep injustice. But it wasn't the humiliation that stayed with her. It was the lesson. Not for her, but for those who had watched, for those who now believed. Her return to the bench was met with quiet applause from colleagues, subtle nods in the hallway, and handwritten letters from young law students who said, "Because of you, I stayed in school. Because of you, I spoke up. Because of you, I know quiet resistance can still shake the ground." Her first day back, she presided over an appellate hearing involving a civil liberties case. A young black mother had filed suit after being unjustly detained during a traffic stop. The courtroom was packed, journalists in the back, students in the gallery, but Celeste didn't perform. She adjudicated. She listened intently, asked incisive questions, ruled with fairness, and recessed without drama. When the gavel came down, there was no pause for praise, only process. Because for her, justice had never been about spectacle. It had always been about consistency. After court, she stood by her window overlooking the Capitol skyline. The sun cut through heavy clouds, streaking her desk with gold. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, but not diminished. She knew that her name would live on in law school casebooks, that internal policy memos would quote her testimony, and that Eleanor Stratton's name would remain a cautionary tale. But none of that was why she came back. She came back because somewhere, right now, a young girl was standing in a line, being stared at for no reason at all. And while that girl may never wear a robe or hold a gavel, she deserved the same rights, the same safety, and the same respect as anyone else. Celeste adjusted the cuffs of her sleeves, turned away from the window, and returned to her desk. Because justice doesn't arrive through noise. It is built, quietly, persistently, by those who never stopped believing in it. In the end, they didn't just arrest the wrong woman, they exposed the right question. How many people have been silenced in places like airports, courtrooms, or sidewalks, simply because someone decided they didn't belong? Judge Celeste Morgan didn't raise her voice. She didn't retaliate with rage. She responded with truth, with law, with quiet strength. And in doing so, she reminded us that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks calmly, it waits patiently, then it speaks, clearly and with consequences. So the next time someone assumes they know your story just by looking at you, remember this: their perception is not your identity, and silence, when grounded in truth, can still shake power to its core. If this story moved you, taught you something, or simply made you pause, tap the like button so more people hear it. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded what quiet strength looks like. Comment below if you've ever been misjudged, or if you've ever stood silently, waiting for someone to speak up. And most of all, subscribe to the channel for more stories that expose injustice, elevate courage, and remind us, change doesn't always start with shouting. Sometimes it starts with standing.